Okay. Well, welcome to the Second District PTA 411 session. Just a little bit of history about our 411 sessions. We actually started these during the pandemic as a way to stay connected with our San Francisco PTAs and the San Francisco Unified School District community while everyone was staying in place. It's a term we don't hear much anymore, staying in place. But we decided to continue these virtual meetings just because it allowed for people to just more conveniently join and have mini trainings periodically. And sometimes we bring speakers from SFUSD as well. So my name is Melissa Mountain, and I'm part of the Second District PTA, which is the sort of over umbrella over all of our San Francisco unit or school site PTAs. And this session tonight, we're going to focus on the basics of PTA nominating committees and elections. And we will post the recording on our YouTube channel, Second District PTA YouTube channel, and we will also share the slide deck with the speaker notes. So you can just, enjoy and sit back. Don't need to take a ton of notes because we will share all of this with you. And I always like to just start back with remembering the mission statement of the California PTA, which is to positively impact the lives of all children and families. And so our role at Second District PTA is to support you in doing that. So that's why this is an important topic, the nominating committees, because that helps to identify your PTA's future leaders who will help carry out the PTA's mission. And so, what is a nominating committee? The purpose of the nominating committee is to select candidates for next year's PTA leadership. So where can you learn more about nominating committees besides attending this or watching this video? The first place to check is your bylaws. Your bylaws will tell you how many members are on the committee. It's going to provide the timeline for the committee's duties. Members serving on the nominating committee are elected members by your association. So that usually happens in January, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. And it's usually happening because it's 2 months prior to when your election is. So again, you look at your bylaws. Well, your elections are either going to be March or April. So your nominating committee would be elected itself by your association in either January or February. The reason being that you want to give your nominating committee about a month at least of time to search for nominees, and then there's a 28-day requirement to post that slate of nominees before the election. Next slide, please. So we'll drill in a little bit on how does the nominating committee work. And again, a lot of answers to things you have about PTA will be in your bylaws. So I recommend getting very familiar with those. A nominating committee, you'll check your bylaws to see how many members are on your committee. And it's usually going to be 3 or 5. So you'll notice that's an odd number. That's to break a tie of any votes. We do recommend that you have 5 rather than 3 because that just helps to share the workload and share the responsibilities. But of course, we understand that some PTAs are smaller or having trouble recruiting volunteers. So having a 3-person nominating committee is perfectly fine. The bylaws will also indicate a number of alternates to serve on this committee. So it's usually, say, 3 nominating committee members and 1 or 2 alternates. And just so you understand, the alternates don't actually serve. It's not like a jury where they have alternates waiting and participating in it. The alternates are actually not involved unless someone really drops out of the whole process. You will learn about which officers are to be slated as nominees through your bylaws. So your bylaws list what type of officers you have. President, secretary, and treasurer are the required roles. And so your bylaws will tell you which ones. The nominating committee is not tasked with slating appointed officers. So those are people like the roles like parliamentarian and committee chairs. Those are appointed by the president. They might meet a lot of volunteers that are interested, and maybe they could recommend to the president who could fill out some of those appointments. But the nominating committee's role is simply to find people to fill the voted roles for next year. The timeline for the nominating committee is also outlined in your bylaws. As current officers, it's never too early to think about your successors. The sooner the better is for mentoring and for transitioning your leaders in the PTA. Your membership will vote to approve the committee. Remember, I said about 2 months prior to the election. You will find that your elections are no later than the second week in April. Um, and that gives, again, the nominating committee time to find people and present their slate of nominees 28 days prior. One of the great things I think about serving on the nominating committee is that it's a finite position, so you know what your responsibilities are. It's very clear, and there's a definite end time. So your role as responsibilities end at the election. Okay, next slide, please. We're on nominating committee members. So the nominating committee, and sometimes I'll just say NomCom for short, is sometimes referred to as the most important committee in PTA. And that's because these are the committee members that are identifying your future leaders of the PTA. So there are a few things that actually disqualify a person from serving on the nominating committee. First of all, you have to have been a member for at least 30 days. You can't have served on the nominating committee the prior year. So you could serve on it this year, take a break and serve on it again, but they don't want you to do 2 consecutive years. And you can't be the current president. The current president is a member of all committees except the nominating committee. And these are just things that help to ensure an unbiased nomination process. So what types of qualities would you want to find in a nominating committee member? Someone who understands the school culture. Ideally, you'll find a committee that represents the diversity in your community, or who can at least recognize your community's diversity so they can make every attempt to mirror that in a slate of nominees that they identify for your PTA's leadership. Confidentiality is a really important quality. Someone that's a trusted community member. A lot of times there's some sensitive information that's shared with the nominating committee members about people that they're considering. So you want to stick to confidentiality and trust. And then just having a good understanding of the roles that each officer has. So talking to the current officers, asking them what their job is about so they can really describe the duties to the people that they're recruiting. Just to note that the principal and the parliamentarian could be elected members of the nominating committee, but they're not necessarily members by just virtue of their role. They do need to be elected. The principal is always involved in some capacity because whether or not they're elected, they can always be an advisor, but the decision comes down to a vote of the actual committee members. Next slide.
I have a quick question. Sorry, Melissa.
Sure.
On the previous slide, it says under qualifications, representative of your community. I wasn't clear on what is meant by that. Could you?
So you do need to be a PTA member, but right by that bullet point, I was more referring to you don't want to have, everyone of one group. You don't want to have everyone on the committee that's all in fifth grade, for example. So try to represent, multiple grades, multiple experiences, all types of diversity on your nominating committee, as well as your actual board.
Okay, thank you.
So just having leaders that are representative of your community.
Okay, I get it. Thank you.
Yep. So in the next slide, one with the cup. Thank you. One of the roles of the parliamentarian is to call the first meeting for the nominating committee. And again, that parliamentarian doesn't need to be an actual member of the committee, but they would still call that first meeting. And that is just to help explain and give instructions. The parliamentarian will ensure everyone has the current bylaws. They'll confirm which roles are the elected roles, review that with you, show you where to find the job descriptions on, it's called CAPTA.org for CaliforniaPTA.org. There's a ton of information on CAPTA.org about nominating committees and elections, including the checklist, and you'll see that checklist is linked there. One of the first things the nominating committee will do is elect its own chair to help lead that committee. And they'll review the officer positions, the duties, and decide how they're going to share the work of recruiting. So in this case, process should be more than just an email. I know a lot of meetings feel like it can should just be able to be taken care of on an email, but of course you can keep in touch with updates via email. But this process, it is really nice to either meet in person for discussions or be able to hold at least a virtual meeting. And next slide. Just drill into some of the committee's responsibilities a bit here. You are going to select just one nominee for each voted position, and you want to try to focus on those three required roles, which are president, treasurer, and secretary. Remember that appointments to the board, um, like parliamentarian and committee chairs, are not part of the nominating committee's responsibility, but the NomCom could provide a list of names and information about volunteers to the next board's president as recommendations. And the responsibility is only for those elected positions to be slated. You can ask for suggestions from the community, speak with the current officers. Maybe they've been thinking about someone who would be great to fill their role the next year. And I wanted to also note that the nominating committee is not committed to slating an officer for a second term. So for example, if someone is the secretary for the first time, they shouldn't feel obligated to have that person be secretary for a second year in a row. They are 1-year terms. You can serve in the same officer role for 2 years in a row. Then you need to take a break and do a different role, and then you could return to that same one. So if you love secretary, you could do secretary 2 years in a row and then take a break and come back to it. What kind of qualifications does the committee want to find in volunteers? You do want to look for skills. So, if you're trying to fill the role of treasurer, you probably want to find someone that, is interested in numbers and doing treasurer type duties. But don't forget that PTA is also an opportunity to learn. So you kind of want to have a balance of that for, someone that hates numbers and doesn't like math, maybe that they don't want to do treasurer. So it is an opportunity to learn. You don't need to be a professional to fill some of these roles, or to fill any role really.
Sorry,
Um,
just to clarify, you were saying that I am consecutive, you're not required to serve a second year consecutively, but you can. It's max 2 consecutive years. But if you took a break, you could serve 1 year, take a break, and serve another year. And it's 2 years max total, right?
2 years max in a row, 2 consecutive years. You can't serve a third consecutive year.
Okay, so then say someone wanted to keep serving and they took a break each time, they can keep serving in that same role, but like a break within each year, or I'm just trying to
Yeah, so let's see. So if you were president for one full term from July 1st is a normal start of a term through June 30th. And then you were slated on the nominating committee slated you to be president a second year. They could not slate you for a third year. You could take the year off and then serve again that fourth year. But by taking a year off, you could serve as executive vice president or a different role on the board, just not in the same exact role,
Okay.
just to give other people a chance.
Gotcha. Okay. All right.
Does
Thank you.
that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, perfect sense. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. You want to Part of the role is that you're going to be presenting this, at least that's part of your bylaws, is you have to present the slate about 28, well, exactly 28 days before the election. No sooner than that. You need at least 28 days to give people a chance to understand who is being nominated. Everyone has a chance to still run for a position. We'll talk a little bit more about that one of the future slides. And part of the role of the chair of the nominating committee is that they will present the report. It's simply just reading the names and the roles that they've chosen at the meeting. Okay, next slide. Got some do's and don'ts. So you do want to give careful consideration to the qualifications of your nominees. You don't want to slate someone just because they're your friend, and you also don't want to push someone into doing something that they really don't want to do. You do want to adhere to confidentiality, as I mentioned. Avoid repeating what's discussed with you about potential nominees and keep confidential what you and other members have discussed during deliberations. And hopefully the committee does find qualified candidates who are truly interested and understand their roles. We've seen volunteers take a role just for the title, president or whatever it is, and just not make themselves available to carry out those responsibilities. And that's not helpful for anyone. And it's also can be unfortunate when someone's excited to volunteer, but they weren't really prepared and didn't understand what their role was. So those are important things for the nominating committee to think about. And the next slide, talk about the actual election a bit. The election meeting is an association meeting, and that is identified in your bylaws. It'll either be March or April. And as I mentioned, it's never later than that second week in April. And the reason for that is not just only that it allows for more transition time, but we also have an annual PTA convention that has a lot of training. So it gives those new leaders opportunity for the training as well. You have to have been a current member for 30 days in order to vote in the election. The chair of the nominating committee should be present to present the report. And it's actually the president that still runs the election. Even if that president is on the slate themselves for that second term, they still run the election. No issues with that. And next slide. There's a lot of resources for helping you to run the election that are available on that capta.org website. There's an election checklist as well, and even a script that you can read literally word for word to help the chair, who's the president, as well as the parliamentarian. The parliamentarian is asked to read parts of the bylaws during the election meeting. And I mentioned the nominating committee chair reads the reports. The names for all the slated nominees are read aloud, but they don't need to be present at the meeting to be elected. And then, as I mentioned, nominations are always called from the floor. So you want to be as inclusive as possible. And this gives a chance for those people that were not slated to still volunteer and speak up and say, oh, I'd like to run for president. And we'll talk a little bit about what happens when there's more than one person that would like position on a future slide here coming up. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So here it is. So most elections aren't terribly contested and is more finding a struggle to find people to fill the roles, but it does happen that more than one person is interested in a position. The nominating committee, they will only slate one nominee for each role, in which case you can do a voice vote. But if there is more than one nominee running from the floor, then you need to have a ballot vote. And there could be multiple people running from floor. So a lot of our meetings are still virtual, even though we've come past the pandemic. It helps, or they're hybrid, half in person and half online. And so there's a lot of information about how to run a good hybrid meeting and how to do electronic voting with people that are on Zoom, for example. So we have that information linked for you when we share the slides later. If you're having an only in-person meeting, just have your paper ballots ready. You can appoint a teller, they call them, the people that are counting the votes. Just make sure those are not the actual nominees. And so, again, there's going to be a lot of links to share with information about that, but we won't go into detail about that here. So next slide. So I mentioned this once before, but I do think the nominating committee is great for anyone that really likes that defined role. As a member on this committee, you have a timeline and that your role ends at the election. So you've had your election and now you're elected. What's next? Do you start the very next day? Well, in some ways you do, but you won't actually be the president, for example, until your fiscal year begins, which for most of us is July 1st. But you are still an officer-elect. And so what that means is you can start planning for the upcoming school year, and there's several things you could start planning. You could prepare for next year's budget. You could start planning the calendar. You just hold a meeting with your newly elected officers. You can do things like ratify the president-elect's appointments, the parliamentarian and the committee chairs or any other appointed roles that you have on your board. If there were any vacancies that were for roles that were not elected. So either the nominating committee didn't find anyone to slate for that particular role, or just no one was elected. It's that new board's job to fill those vacancies. This is one time that votes don't go back to the membership. So that board elect, or if it comes to the new school year, that board will fill vacancies themselves. It is a good idea to make an announcement to the community that, and they can help you out. People will volunteer, hopefully, or make suggestions. And then once your board does elect to fill a vacancy, you would want to just share that information. Bye, Michelle. Next slide. We're almost done here. We go to the Q&A. I'll start out with a couple of common questions and then happy to take more questions. But common one is, can two volunteers share a position? We often see people want to have co-officers, especially co-presidents, just to share that work, and it can be helpful in recruiting. People think it can be helpful. I'm sure it is in recruiting. So you've got a partner, but there are no co-officers in PTA. And so you can consider appointing supporting officers. So that's why we have president and executive vice president as elected roles. But there just does need to be one president who signs off on things, for example. If you want to have a fundraising VP, rather than having co-fundraising chairs, you might have the VP of fundraising and a supporting VP or chair of the committee. So just no co-officers. And can one person be nominated for more than one office? Yes, but you can only serve in one role. So you don't get two votes on a board, and you can only actually serve in one official role. And are there any questions about either nominating committees or elections? I'll take just some general questions while we're still recording, and then we can, if you have any specific or personal questions, we could stop recording and ask some more.
Okay, so this is Tona. And I feel like, I really do feel like this is probably going to be a really dumb question, because maybe you already made this clear and I didn't pick up on it. So the nominating committee is responsible for getting a slate of nominees for the next school year, right? And they can only nominate one person per position. Is that right?
Correct.
So is there a vote on the slate?
Yes, that's what the election is. So when the nominating,
what happens if the people anyone on the slate is not voted in?
Do you mean they're on the slate? And so the slate is an approve or not approve type of vote. So they vote to approve the slate, or they vote not to approve. If there was a vote not to approve, very rare, then if nobody else runs from the floor, then that position would be vacant.
Oh, okay.
The nominating committee is again said to be one of the most important committees, because they are taking the time and doing a lot of the research and trying to make those evaluations and say who they think are the best people for this role after being interviewed. Some people do interviews, some people do applications. That kind of information is also, you don't need to come up with it yourself. It's on capta.org. And so a lot of trust is put into the nominating committee, but it's not 100%, because there's still always an opportunity for people to still volunteer, even though someone has had official nomination.
Okay, I think I get it. Thank you.
And also just want to be clear that sometimes the slate of nominees could have just one person or even none. Sometimes if the nominating committee does not have anyone, then that's their report. They say nobody has been slated, and then you'd go to the election, and you would hope that someone runs from the floor at that point. They see that nobody's volunteering. Hopefully someone steps up at that point. In worst case scenarios, you would just have to be flexible. And so sometimes it does come to the fall where you have another fall election, and then people can fill the roles then or throughout the year.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. . Did we stop recording? Oh, we can.